Hey, Lance.
Oh, sorry. What's up, everyone? Lance Hedrick here. And on this channel, we do all things coffee. Today, we're going to talk about taste. So go ahead, brew yourself a cup of coffee, pour it out, have a seat, get cozy, and let's chat. Alright, so why do I think that this is necessary? It's because there is a massive disconnect that I have noticed between home enthusiasts and coffee professionals. Now, being both of these, a coffee professional of the past decade, as well as very active in online forums and in the home barista community, I felt like it was necessary to try and perhaps give my knowledge on both ends in order to have some sort of common lexicon, a shared vocabulary, so that communication is more efficient and we can kind of understand each other's needs. This way, roasters can know what home enthusiasts are looking for, and home enthusiasts can know what roasters are giving out. And this also allows for just more easy communication across all realms, from us to producers, to roasters, to enthusiasts, to consumers, to whatever it might be. So we're going to look at these different ways of discussing flavor. First, go ahead, everyone who's watching, have a sip of your coffee. And let's begin. So the first thing that I really want to discuss is what I have noticed to be perhaps the greatest misconception, which is surrounding the word clarity. It seems that most people have no real idea what that word even entails when it comes to coffee. I see people throwing it around left and right in the same way that the word strength is used. Clarity is often used to describe coffees when you can taste a lot of flavors, or when a coffee is thin, or when a coffee is bright, or when a coffee is washed. There's just not really any sort of consistent understanding of what that term means. So today I want to propose an alternative understanding, as well as a second term, in order to differentiate between that and what some people are using clarity for. Now, this other word I got from my friend who goes by the name Shotwell on the Espresso Aficionado Discord, and the word he uses is fidelity. So we have these two terms, clarity and fidelity. Oftentimes, people use clarity to describe both of these, but instead I think it'd be important to introduce this new term into our vocabulary in order to have more understanding on both ends. Now, to describe them, it's as simply as follows. Clarity would refer to delineation of flavor, or flavor separation as I like to call it. So when you're tasting a coffee from a certain brew method or a certain style of coffee and you taste it, you're able to truly see all these different flavors clearly. So if there's a heavy malic acidity and a heavy citric acidity, you have the very easy ability to differentiate between tangerine and maybe apple, right? Like a Fuji apple. You can tell distinctly those differences. Now, if it had high fidelity, maybe you have both of those acidities, but you don't really have a strong delineation between the two. Maybe it's pineapple, and it's a heavy pineapple, and there's not much else there. That would be a high fidelity coffee, or a high fidelity brewing process. Now, you can obviously have both of these, but it's a little bit more difficult and perhaps won't even taste that good. So the way I like to kind of think about it is typically really clean washed coffees tend to have a higher clarity when brewed well. Meaning, if you brew it with, say, a V60, you're going to have a lot of delineation of flavors. You're going to have florals like jasmine or chamomile. You'll have fruits like apricot or white peach, or you'll have sweetness like specifically vanilla or white sugar, something like that. Whereas a high fidelity coffee, maybe like a natural Ethiopian, is going to taste like, boom, blueberry muffins. And that's what you have. You have brown sugar sweetness, and you have this like boozy characteristic all kind of intertwined, and it's heavy hitting, and it's there. And you know it's there, and it's always there regardless of the brewing method. You have high fidelity there. So I hope that kind of makes sense. You have this separation of flavor when you have clarity, and you kind of have this perfect representation of what that coffee might be, in which case it could be wine, or it could be these deep grapes, or it could be an intense stone fruit. You have high fidelity. So if we're talking about a coffee and we're like, wow, this has a really high fidelity. It's a natural Ethiopia with a high fidelity in this brew. You're really getting the blueberry. All that person is saying is this has a heavy blueberry, which might be representative of that terroir or of that specific farm or of that specific variety or whatever it might be. We're saying there's a high fidelity to that flavor. Whereas with clarity, we might say, wow, this brew is giving me much more clarity than this other brew, which might be a French press versus a V60. You're getting a lot more flavor distinctions in the V60 versus a French press, which might muddle them all together. So that's the first kind of delineation I would like to make. So now we're going to talk about strength just briefly because I did bring it up. People always talk about, oh, this coffee's too strong. Oh, it's too weak. It's blah, 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 blah. So let's just get this kind of understood. Strong can mean a lot of different things. So instead of using the word strong, let's try to be a little bit more exact with our phrasing. So if we're tasting a coffee and it's very pungent, it's very thick, we can talk about it being too high in strength as far as the concentration goes. I think that's where we need to talk about strength, is concentration of the coffee. This is a strong coffee. It's highly concentrated. That does not mean that it has a high extraction. That does not mean that it's really bitter. It means that it's very thick and pungent. Whereas a weak coffee would have like a low TDS. It would have a low strength. Okay, so when we're talking weak to strong, I think that should be in regard to the thickness or the thinness of the coffee, the potency of the coffee itself. Essentially, how thick is it? If we were to refract it, would it have a really high total dissolved solid number, or would it have a really low one? Is it closer to water, or is it closer to milk? Strong, weak in that regard. Now, some people also think in terms of caffeine. That doesn't really make much sense because, as you probably know from other videos, roast level doesn't really dictate caffeine. In Arabica, you have a pretty constant caffeine amount per bean. So what really matters is the amount of beans in your dose. A really darkly roasted coffee in a 20-gram dose, you'll actually have more caffeine than a 20-gram dose of the same exact coffee that's roasted really lightly. And the reason is not because darker roasted coffees have more caffeine. It's because darker roasted coffees are more brittle, they weigh less, so you can get more beans in a 20-gram dose than you can in a 20-gram dose of a really lightly roasted coffee, because the coffee doesn't lose as much weight. One might lose 20% in the roasting process, one might lose 25%. So if you have more beans in the dose, you have more caffeine. So strength, I don't think should refer to caffeine, but that is frequently what people talk about. And then people also use strong to refer to bitter levels. That is, I would not advise that either. If we're talking about bitterness, just call a duck, call a spade a spade. This is a really bitter coffee. It's really bitter. Oh, this isn't very bitter. Easy as pie. All right, let's move on because that's not really what I wanted to hit here. Next, I want to jump into essentially how competitive baristas refer to coffee. Now, there are these competitions referred to as Brewer's Cup, barista competition, etc., where baristas will prepare a coffee and present it to sensory judges. And the whole point, the majority of the points, is to present this flavor profile, present this coffee in a way that will be reciprocated by the judges. They will taste it and they will have the experience that is presented to them. The closer the experience you present to the judges is actually experienced, the higher your score is, the more likely you'll win. So the ways that people refer to coffees, the ways that they talk about the flavor is in regard to the flavor at different temperatures. Now, when we speak flavor, we're talking about initially what hits your tongue. So when we take a sip of freshly brewed coffee, what is the immediate experience on your tongue? And we're going to talk about what I'm drinking right now is a really nice washed Kenya. I'm getting a little bit of blackberry, I'm getting a little bit of currant, and I'm getting some light brown sugar. So that's the immediate flavor when it's hot. And then, of course, as that flavor sits on your tongue with that hot taste, it's going to hit and have an aftertaste. And typically, you kind of feel this on the sides of your tongue and in the back of your mouth. And so you talk about that hot aftertaste. And obviously, I refer to it as hot, even though it's cooled in my mouth, because as coffee is cooling, you're losing volatile aromatics. So the actual chemistry of the coffee will change as well. So you want to discuss these different flavors, aftertaste, etc., as it's cooling down. So hot taste, cool taste, warm taste, etc. So we have the aftertaste, what's lingering in my mouth right now as I sit and kind of retrohale, just as I sit and do that, what I'm getting is some grapefruit. I have that kind of like pithy grapefruit drying bit on my tongue, maybe some black tea as well as it sits around my tongue. So that's the difference between flavor and aftertaste. As the coffee is cooling, I'll be able to experience a different flavor and a different aftertaste. Or maybe it's the same. It depends on the coffee. But that's what we kind of talk about when we're referring to flavor and aftertaste, is the sensation on the tongue immediately and then the sensation on the tongue as it sits there. And it will change as the temperature goes down. Now, another thing that people talk about is the acidity. Now, acidity always needs a qualifier. So if you're talking about, oh, this is citric. Well, citric like what? Is it citric like a lemon? Is it citric like a lime? Is it citric like a pomegranate? What is the qualification for the citric acidity that you are tasting? So as you're tasting, of course, it's not identical to any of these. More so when you're tasting coffee, it's what does it remind you of? Does it remind you of the citric acidity of a lemon? Does it remind you of the citric acidity of a pomegranate? Does it remind you of the malic acidity of an apple? What does it remind you of? When you taste it, what are the memories that kind of come to the surface? There's no such thing as someone having necessarily a better palate as someone else. There are people who have more experience tasting. There are people with a bigger lexicon or vocabulary, and so they're able to bring to mind more words as they're tasting. But in reality, it's just making connections to memories. Food is memories. So the more you taste, the more you consciously taste, the more you're going to be perceived as a good cupper or a good taster. That's all it really is tasting and tasting and tasting and kind of understanding the connections between that and different foods. So go to your local supermarket, buy a lot of different fruits, jackfruits if you have them. I know parts of the world those are very well known. Buy dragon fruits, buy passion fruits, buy all different types of even vegetables and herbs and all of these different things to really expand your palate knowledge. Once you have more and more of that knowledge, when you're tasting something, you won't be going, oh, this tastes like, You'll immediately know, oh, that tastes like jackfruit. Boom. Because you've tasted it so much, you know what it tastes like. And it's good for you. Go get some fruits and veggies. Now, as we talk about acidity, some people will talk about crispness or juiciness. They'll talk about the tartness or the drying effect, like tartaric acid that's present in red wine. Or they'll talk about a tannic effect, like something in a red wine, right? So when we're talking about these things, it's just referring to the acidity level. So when these competitive baristas talk about acidity, they'll talk in terms of when it's hot, it might be citric like a tangerine. That doesn't mean it tastes like a tangerine. It means the intensity of the acidity reminds them of a tangerine or of a grapefruit or of a lemon or of a lime or whatever it might be. That doesn't necessarily mean the coffee tastes like lime. We're talking about acidity intensity, okay? Same thing with the crispiness. What does crisp mean? That's referring to like when you bite into an apple, it's very crisp. It has this kind of intense effect that reminds you of bright colors, right? It's very clean in its cutoff of those flavors. So it's not a muddled taste. It's a very clean, crisp flavor. When we talk in terms of juicy, it's a similar thing like biting into a ripe peach. We're talking about it makes you salivate. It's juicy. It's phosphoric, kind of like when you're drinking a Coca-Cola. That's actually a very common flavor note I've heard is phosphoric, like a Coca-Cola or some sort of soda that makes you salivate. It's crispy, it's juicy, and it has all these different characteristics about it. As you keep moving on, we of course have one of the big ones, which is body. Now, body can be separated into a few different things: weight, tactile, mouthfeel, etc. So when you take a sip of your coffee, I like to just lightly swish it on my tongue to kind of understand the weight of the coffee sitting on my tongue. Is it a lightweight? Is it close to water? Is it kind of medium weight? Is it close to maybe like a skim milk? Or is it heavy like a full fat milk or like an almond milk or oat milk or a yogurt even? Is it like a kefir? And of course it's not actually like that because this is a thin beverage. But when you're sipping relative to the coffees, there's some that are heavier than others and some that are lighter than others. So that would be the weight of the coffee, is how does it sit on your tongue? That would be weight. Tactile would kind of refer to how it interacts with your tongue. Is it kind of bouncy? Is it springy? Does it kind of envelop your mouth, right? Is it silky? Does it slide off your tongue? You know, you've had some coffees that might be waxy, where it kind of, it feels like you've had white chocolate. It kind of covers your tongue. Is it oily? Is it vibrant? Does it have these different types of characteristics? So as we sip my coffee, it's very silky. It has a very silky structure. It just flies off the tongue. Doesn't leave much residue. The aftertaste is really nice. It doesn't have this waxy, bitter, drying effect. Instead, it's a quick, effervescent, bubbly type of body to it. All right, so lastly, after we talk about acidity, we've talked about flavor, we've talked about aftertaste, we've talked about clarity and fidelity, we've talked about strength, and we talked about tactile and weight. What we kind of end with is balance. How do all of these things we talked about, how do they play into one another? What does balanced coffee even mean? Well, balanced is essentially how much do all of these play off of one another. So when you take a sip, you take into account the sweetness and how it plays with the acidity. Does one dominate the other? How is the mouthfeel holding up everything? So you would use a phrase like the acidity is being, or the sweetness is being pronounced by the acidity and is held together in a a rounding effect in the mouth based off of the tactile. It has a medium weight that's not overwhelming, and it allows for some effervescence as it's sitting there. Now, you don't have to be fancy in how you're describing it, but balance is an attempt to see how they're playing off of each other, and if they're playing well with each other, or if they are just kind of randomly muddled all together in there. Do you have to really sit and think hard about, what is the acidity in here? It's kind of taken over by the sweetness in the body. Or what is the sweetness in here? It's a very acidic cup. Is the coffee balanced in that they all play off harmoniously, or is it skewed towards one of the things? Is it mostly a heavy body coffee and everything else is drowned in that? Or is it mostly a bitter coffee or a really sweet coffee, or whatever it might be? Balance is the idea of how do they interplay with one another. You can really enjoy imbalanced coffees. That's not a crime. You don't have to have a balanced cup of coffee. You could really enjoy heavy acidic coffees, really potently sour or whatever it might be. That might be your thing, and that's completely valid. But the idea is trying to find a way to communicate to someone else what your coffee is tasting like based off of your water, based off of your recipe, based off of your equipment, based off the coffees that you like and their roast profiles, their processing methods. So I hope that with this, you can kind of understand a little bit better how to communicate your taste experience to someone else. And when you see roasters referring to different flavors or different experiences, you can kind of understand what they're meaning. If what a lot of people do on their bags is they will try to present one from a few different categories to help you understand what their coffee roughly tastes like. You'll see maybe a sugar browning note like brown sugar, or a milk chocolate or something like that. You'll see a floral note, elderflower or chamomile or jasmine. You'll see a fruit note, maybe two fruit notes. Often you'll see two, which one might be citric, one might be malic, one might be tropical. You might have passion fruit and mango, whatever it might be. Typically you see 3 to 4 flavor notes on a bag, and that's what they're trying to do, is give you an understanding of what this coffee tasted like on a cupping table. If they say, wow, this brewing method gives you high clarity, what the person is saying is, or hopefully what they're saying, is that this coffee will be delineating their flavors on this brewer method. So a V60 will give you much higher clarity than a French press ever could inherently. Now the French press might give you more fidelity. It might give you a better representation of what the main flavor of that bean is, but the V60 is going to give you more clarity. So kind of take these definitions, try to put them into your daily usage when you're talking to friends, when you're talking to roasters, your coffee shop, your barista. These are kind of what we're trying to get across. This is what is used in competition, and this is also just kind of the standard understanding of what these words are, with the addition of fidelity, which I think is an important addition to be made. But other than that, with these terminologies, you can understand what people are doing in competition, what they're doing on cupping scores, what they're doing at Cup of Excellence, and so forth. So I hope you enjoyed this video, sipping along with me, or if you're fancy and cupping along with me with the fancy little spoon. I hope this video was helpful, and I hope that you'll be able to take a lot of this away and use it in your daily lives. I would also like to ask at this time, if you haven't, hit the subscribe button. That really helps. I know a lot of people tend to forget to do that. I actually had a friend that I was with yesterday who watches all James Hoffman videos but hadn't hit subscribe yet. So I know a lot of you forget. So, friendly reminder, hit that subscribe, hit the like, leave a comment if you enjoyed my content at all. Every like, every subscribe, all really helps for me to grow this channel, which in turn helps me to fund it, fund production value, fund the equipment for new videos, and just really motivates me. So I really appreciate all that support. Check out my Patreon below. That obviously helps all of those efforts as well. Other than that, I hope that the cup you brewed was tasty. I hope you brew some more tasty stuff, and cheers.